Welcome back to the Theology of Business podcast with host Darren Shearer. This is the show that helps marketplace Christians to partner with God in business to help you make disciples of your company, your industry, and your community. If you want to learn more about how to do business for the glory of God and shape culture through discipling the business world, this show is for you. You can get more of the Theology of Business Institute's interviews and teachings like the one you're about to hear at theologyofbusiness.com.
Before we dive into the content for this episode, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Highbridge Books. If you're a Christian and you want to write, publish, and sell a book, you really need to contact us. In fact, you can contact me directly because this is my company. You can reach me at darren@highbridgebooks.com. Our authors have sold many tens of thousands of life-changing books for the glory of God, and we're always looking for more Christian thought leaders to work with. You can take a look at our publishing package and some of the other services we offer at highbridgebooks.com. And you can also learn about some of our incredible authors and their books. So go to highbridgebooks.com. All right, let's jump into this amazing episode. On this episode, we're joined by my good friend and former divinity school professor, Dr. Antipas Harris. He was actually my pulpit ministry professor at Regent University. And in addition to being able to glean such excellent mentorship in his classroom, we just became good friends, had a lot of deep philosophical, theological conversations outside of the classroom, and got to take some road trips together. And he's just one of my favorite people in the whole world. He's now the president and dean of Jake's Divinity School and serves on the pastoral staff at the Potter's House, I should say, in Dallas, Texas. And before Bishop T.D. Jakes appointed him to this role, he was the founding dean of the Urban Renewal Center in Norfolk, Virginia. I got to say Norfolk. That's how they really say it out there. And he's the author of several books that I've had the privilege of publishing, including Unstoppable Success, Monday Morning Inspiration, and The Gifted Worshipper. And his latest book is titled, Is Christianity the White Man's Religion? How the Bible is Good News for People of Color. And he's a public theologian. I love that term. And he thinks deeply about the inequalities in our society through a biblical lens, and with so many inequities in the world today, not the least of which is income inequality. And that's what I really want to talk about with him today. So Dr. Antipas, thanks for joining us.
It's a delight to be here, Darren. I'm honored, thrilled for the opportunity.
Yeah, and so for the many business professionals and others who are involved in what God's doing in the marketplace, I want to dive into this issue with you of income inequality, especially as it relates to those who own and manage businesses. What has been your personal experience, and how has your personal experience informed your approach to this issue?
Well, mostly my personal experience has sort of developed out of my family history, and also that's one context. And the other context would be the work that I've done in the inner city. Now, I want to be clear that I am not from the inner city. I'm from a very rural community, but a lot of my ministry, adult ministry, has been within the urban context. So I'll start with my family background, deeply rooted in the deep South in Georgia. My grandfather fought in World War II, and from a little town called Warm Springs. You recognize it from President Roosevelt, the little White House. It's there in Warm Springs, Georgia, and that's where my grandfather and grandmother are from on my mom's side. And my dad is from Manchester, my hometown, and then grew up in Columbus, Georgia. So very rural areas in Georgia, very poor family, working poor. My grandfather, after he came out of the war, of course, he had a family and built. My grandmother was a working woman who had African-American woman from Greenville, Georgia, who was a businesswoman, and business for her was to, railroad was a big thing for African-Americans in those days, working on the railroad, laying the railroad track. So as they came down the coast or down through Greenville, Georgia, she recognized that the African American railroad workers did not have a place to live. So she created what she would term as a little hotel on her house. She actually built it herself, by the way.
Oh, wow.
And she would charge them rent as they would stay there at a portion of her house. And she became one of the entrepreneurs in the area who built her wealth. Now, some of it was not legal because she did sell moonshine as well in those days. But she was a businesswoman. She made it work, right?
Yes.
In those days, it takes my great aunt to talk about it. She was such an aggressive businesswoman that my great grandfather was not proactive enough. So she put him out because she needed to build her business, and he was too lazy for her. So we love to tell that story. But at any rate, she would have a hotel in her house, sell moonshine, and she was a midwife because many African Americans couldn't go to the hospitals in those days. So she would deliver babies for the African American women. And so she's just an entrepreneur. And
she could have written a book called Multiple Streams of Income.
There you go. Multiple streams of income. But the downside, here's what I'm going with. The downside of that whole situation is that she did not have a bank account in the early 1900s. She could not have a bank account. So in the local banks that were white owned. So she would put money under her mattress. And of course, her house burned down and her money burned. And she'll just start all over again once she built her house back up. And about the second or third house that burned down, we believe that some of it may have been KKK related, but just burn the house down, build it again. And then she became the bank for the community because now people would come to her and borrow money in the African American community. So you see, it was sort of had that sort of that cultural history in my family in the rural South. And so when my grandfather came out of the war, he couldn't, of course, move into the white side of town. He had to live in the African American side of town. Couldn't access the money that the government was giving to those who came out of war. So he borrowed money from my grandmother, who was his wife, my grandmother's mom. So my great grandmother is who we've been talking about. And so she gave him money to build his little house down in Warm Springs, Georgia. Now, Granddaddy was a chef for 40 years and worked at the Little White House as a chef for 40 years and raised children, and some of whom went to college and others didn't. In those days, in order for African Americans to become middle class, they started to depending heavily on government assets. One of the reasons, and I know we're not talking politics here, but one of the reasons the majority of African Americans shifted from Republicans before the New Deal to become Democrats after the New Deal was because Roosevelt went to the rural South and saw the need for running water and electricity and sort of building up the communities where a lot of African Americans lived in those days. But even more so than that, as the government started developing after the World War II and creating opportunities for African Americans, such as, of course, military was already there, but they built post offices. And when the schools were integrated, it created an opportunity for African Americans to go to college and become school teachers. So there you have it. My mom went to school for education. My dad went to school for education, and he became a English teacher right after desegregation. So economic structure that built the African American community, particularly in the rural South, but across the country, had to do with government jobs. Because that's how African Americans, by and large, went from working poor to become middle class. And so many of them went to college for education or went to the military or became post office workers. And so that was the economic structure. And so that experience for me, the history of my family, shapes how I relate to this discussion about inequality in economics. on the one hand. On the other hand, as I have done a lot of work in the inner cities of America, and I see the plight of the ghettos and barrios. And many of them were because people like my grandmother, I said my grandfather was in the war, came out as a chef. My grandmother went to work for Goody's hair care product. Mm-hmm. And so they had these production lines in the inner cities, and African Americans would then either go to become middle class by teachers or, like I just said, post office workers, or they would go and work for manufacturers on the product lines. And my grandmother worked for Goody Hair Care Product until she was laid off. And she was laid off because jobs started to being shipped overseas. They no longer needed the production lines. And then shortly after, the technology came in and started to replacing the need for the remaining production workers. So you have places like, say, Ferguson and St. Louis or Atlanta, Georgia, where you have all these African Americans moving into the inner city for the job opportunities, the skilled job opportunities. And now they're disappearing, and the moms and dads end up flipping hamburgers in New Haven, Connecticut, flipping hamburgers. And at that point, they're dependent upon minimum wage most of the time to make life happen. So those two sort of strands inform my understanding of how we are where we are now in this economic discussion.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that autobiographical and historical perspective. It definitely helps us to understand where you're coming from. So as you're speaking to our listeners, primarily Christian business professionals, managers of various types, and I like to emphasize the concept of management and managers, because we all have some responsibility in business. If we've got a job, we're managing that job and the resources that come along with it. What are some of those primary biblical themes that need to be informing it, and some of the specific issues that we need to be thinking about, and what the Bible and what God's word has to say on these matters relating to income inequality in kind of the typical small business? And we'll focus here for the sake of this conversation here in the United States. I know we have listeners all over the world, but right here in the US, for the typical small business owners, small business manager at really any level, what are some of those concepts that we need to be thinking about?
I think that the discussion about scripture need to have more to do with how does Christianity, biblical Christianity, encourage or even require us to attend to our neighbor, right? Because before we can talk about the business, we have to talk about the historical social landscape that has gotten us to where we are, and what is our responsibility to get people on an equal playing field, right? Because part of the challenge, and I tried to paint that in my sort of my family history, is my great-grandmother was entrepreneurial, but she had all types of challenges that inhibited her ability to invest that in a way that we can benefit from it 2 and 3 generations later, right? So it wasn't a matter of, did she have the skills? Was she entrepreneurial? Was she a hard worker? But the social landscape didn't allow for her to do what a lot of her white counterparts were doing, that 3, 4 generations later, same work ethic, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren are benefiting. So what I would suggest is that we think about sort of, how do we help people now? We can't just talk about the past, but how do we, as Booker T. Washington put it, drop the bucket where we are? How do we start here? And I think part of it is that Christian business people can think about economic empowerment, right? Because what we have now is opportunity that doesn't meet the need, right? We don't have the same problems she had, but it feels like we do, because the opportunity is way over there and the people with the needs and the skills are way over here. I can give you an example. I have a young man who has a master's degree, African-American young man. He had a past, a criminal past, which drove him to become an entrepreneur. But when he became an entrepreneur, he had only a little bit, right? He had nothing really, but he looked out and saw his lawnmower and said, I'll start a lawn company. And then he built a lawn company from just a lawnmower to a power washing, just whatever he could do. And then, but he hit his capacity, right? Because now he's competing with large lawn companies and he even became a contractor, but he's competing with these guys who have a long history and built big companies, contractors. So he can't compete for the contracts that the city offers to build his company to the capacity where it needs to be. So he's stuck, right? He's stuck on small. Mm-hmm. So I think that Christian business people, once they understand that there are people of color who have great work ethic, who are very skilled and have the ability to run a large company, but don't have an equal playing field because now they're competing with the big guys. So how can we care for our neighbor, see where somebody else is in need, give them a hand up, not a hand out, but a hand up. Maybe that's, create a small contract with a subcontract within their contract to help them grow their company and that sort of thing. I think that could be helpful.
Yeah. So let's say that I'm kind of a mid-level manager in a small business, and I'm listening to this on my lunch break. I'm about to head back into work. What do I need to be thinking about? And then as well for the owner of that company that's probably very actively involved in the day-to-day operation. And I'm talking about the typical small business, not the kind of absentee owner type of a business, but the where the owner is really actively involved, pouring out their sweat equity into the company. What can they do? And understand, like, voting is part of it, and kind of the political, getting involved in the political process to affect change and things like that. But because it seems to me that the business owners have a massive responsibility as it relates to addressing this issue of income inequality. What is what are the biblical concepts, and what is your guidance to those of us who are owning companies?
Yeah, I think that as pertaining to those who own companies, I think one is there's a skill need, right? So owning companies is not humanitarian work, right? Where you're just offering opportunity for people because you have a good heart. But there has to be the skill piece and the work ethic. I think work ethic has to sometimes, the person has to bring skin to the table, right? Skin to the game, the worker. But in terms of skill development, I think that empowering folks who have the right attitude and the right work ethic with education and creating opportunities for them to get the training that they need to move up in the company, rather than to see, there's always a temptation. This is a good worker. I need them there and I need them to stay there. They have great work ethic. They have great character, and then you just sort of, in a way, use them to build a company. And I think that has been the sort of pattern for many years, a tradition for many years, especially as it pertains to really good people. And some are African American, but not all African Americans. So I think that one of our Christian duty is to identify talent, identify raw talent, but identify attitude and work ethic, and see how we can help that person succeed in the vision or the dreams that they have. That could be really helpful.
Yeah. How about the issue of minimum wage? What is the correct Christian response to this issue?
Yeah, I think the correct Christian response. Now, there's always the question of resources. Do we have the resources to increase pay? That's always a given. You can't give people what you don't have. But in general, when we speak of the law, I really think that we should increase it. And partly because people oftentimes who work the hardest are the people at the bottom. And, we can talk about people working, but to be honest with you, you and I know people at the top in capitalism just don't work as hard as people at the bottom. That's how it works. You got to be a worker, be at the bottom. You got to have a lot of people doing a lot of great work for people at the top to be as successful as they are. Now, I'm not saying they do nothing. That is not what I'm saying. But even in my own life, I've done labor work, and it's a lot of work. The work that I do now is a lot of work, but it's a different type of work. So sometimes we measure work based on mechanisms that I think are unfair. And people that are at the bottom cannot live a decent life. I think about here in Dallas. People who work in Dallas and make Dallas functional and clean and whatever good we see in Dallas typically don't live in Dallas because they can't afford it. So they're doing all this hard work to make this environment such a great place to live in for people to come in who make more money than them to enjoy it. And they have to go outside of the city to be a part of a community that is not as equal as the community that they have worked so hard to build. And that's an example of what I mean by the inequity as pertains to minimum wage. People should be allowed to live in the city that they work hard to build.
Yeah. And it makes me think of this, it seems like there's a sense that white collar work is more valuable than blue collar work, as an example, or that quote unquote creative work is more, there's this, what people have termed the creative class, people that when they go to work, they don't necessarily know exactly what their work is going to be that day. They're going to go and create something, like they're going to write code or they're going to do something. And so it's based on the pay scales. It would seem that white collar work or creative work is more valuable than other types of work. What is your take on that?
Well, I think there's an unfairness there. I think the skills are different for different people. Now, I do think that visionary work helps create the world, and it's the people who dream of big ideas. It's the Bill Gates or the Mark Zuckerberg who can imagine something that doesn't exist, that create a space that no one else could have ever imagined. And we all enjoyed it as a result of what they saw in their head. So there is a high value to that. But I think there's inequity in the dreaming and the vision and the people who are working to make it all happen. I think that there is so much money here in the United States at the very top, 1% to 5%, that there is just a disparity as to how many poverty-stricken people who are working their fingers to the bones, and you got 1% or 2% that makes billions and billions of dollars. That it's just unfair. It's not saying that what they do is not valuable at the top, but it is saying there's disparity there, and I think there's a violation of the Christian principle of loving our neighbor and doing unto others as we have them to do unto you, or the whole principle of Christ to care and to support the others as equal human beings. There's just a problem there. And so I think now there are folks who are lazy, but there are also rich people who are lazy because many of them inherit money from their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, and they're just living in the dough, right? But I can't do that, though my grandmother was an entrepreneur, and if she had the great opportunity that others had in the early 1900s, we may be able to do the same thing too. So sometimes we look at people in their situation and we pass judgment based on our point of reference. When I think that as Christians, we're called to listen to the voice of the others and understand where they're coming from, and understand that where we are now is a byproduct of a history that has been dismal and with a lot of inequity and a lot of injustice. We can talk race, we can talk gender, we can talk, even within races. Sometimes it's where you are, where you came from, who you know, what part of the country you were raised in. And I think Christianity requires us to take a look at all those variables and reconsider what is the Christian way of sharing love.
Yes. Yeah. And an author named Jeff Van Duzer came on this show several episodes back. And one of the things that he said is that sometimes we mistake the invisible hand of market forces, to use Adam Smith's term, for the almighty hand of God. So if the market is saying that this job is worth X, then and this type of work is worth so much more, that this is, you're going to make a lot more money doing this, that we can make a theological case in our head that, well, it's probably the same way with God too. God looks at this type of work as being worth much less than this type of work. And that's why we have to really be critical about our business theology, lest we start to always equate what's happening in the market with what God's perfect will and what God's perspective is on these issues.
I agree. That's theological syncretism in its worst way, right? It's where we judge the hand of God based on the market. It's because the country was built on greed and pride. The Africans that were brought here to develop the colonies were working harder than anybody. They were the machine that built the new world until we didn't need them to be the machine anymore, because we can get by cheaper doing it other ways. So this notion that somehow the market determines what's right, what's wrong, is theological syncretism in the worst way. And I think that's where Christianity has to rethink how we're discerning what is right and what is wrong, what is prosperity and what's not, because money cannot be alone prosperity. We know that, looking at it from different ways, but in particular, as we see so many people who have a lot of money, and they're not happy. They need the gospel too. But this barometer of God's success based on money, it needs to be debunked. And we need to really rethink our Christian values around money.
Yeah. John Perkins, the great civil rights activist, he and I'm going to butcher the quote, but he said something along the lines of what every person needs is Jesus and a good job. Because that, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about the opportunity for skills training for that business manager to be able to help somebody rise up in that company. And maybe not that they're necessarily going to stay at that company for the rest of their career, but that we're fulfilling our calling to make disciples. I mean, that's what the Great Commission is, not to go into all the world and make a profit, is to go make disciples. And so I think what you were saying about when I asked you, what is the responsibility that we as Christian business managers have? And you went right to skills training. I think another way of saying that is make disciples, because when you make disciples, people can provide for their families. Like they will figure out a way. You'll be able to guide them and to equip them with the tools that they need to kind of come to the next level. As we wrap it up here, Dr. Antipas, what would be your parting advice for these Christian business managers listening?
What I would suggest is that Christian business people really understand that only in America is money power, and that we have to understand that in order to help others with a hand up, we have to be willing to engage them in such a way that can empower them from an economic perspective. Because, when we talk about the race discussion, for example, sometimes I think we go in circles in this country because we assume race and racism has to do with, whether a white person likes a black person or whether a white person is a friend with a black person. Well, really, I try to get people to think deeper than that. Racism in this country is more ideological and social and economic, that people of goodwill can perpetuate the problem and they don't have a heart to perpetuate the problem. So then we spend a lot of time searching our minds and hearts. Do I love people of color? Do I love white people? That's not the issue. The issue is that in order for people to move from the social location that's down under to a social location that is of equal playing field, there has to be intentionality about the way we think and the way we understand the way the country has had its foot on the back of people of color. That's not whether I like you, you like me. That's not the discussion. This is a social fabric that has to be rewoven. And the only way we can do it is that we have to work together. And business people, because this is such an economic problem, right? We need Christian business people to really understand this issue and be a part of the solution to help overcome that sort of underbellied reality that has really sustained itself so many years. Because there are people who work hard and can't make it because they don't make the money, because they don't have the education. I often said, and I said earlier, that African Americans became middle class by and large because of governmental mechanisms like teaching schools and teaching school or post office workers or military. So much so that when I grew up, my parents told me, you're going to school for music. You really need to take some education courses because I know you want to be a producer, but you need something to fall back on. Well, that safety net was because the government has set it up such a way that it's hard not to get a job to be a teacher when you might not be able to, step into this sort of white man's world and succeed as a businessman, right? Because they were speaking from their point of reference. There are mechanisms in society to keep you from succeeding as an entrepreneur. So that's that fear sets in. I need a safety net that the government provides. And that has all kinds of ramifications. They have ramifications as it pertains to health insurance, because now my health insurance has to be, my mindset is that it's dependent upon a job, a teaching job or something. And we were not taught or exposed to opportunities outside of that job for life insurance and health insurance and investments and things like that. So we had teachers work for years and say they get fired or something, or they retire, and now they don't have health insurance because all this time they have depended on the job and have not invested in any sort of investments outside of that job. So there's a mindset. You follow what I'm saying? There's a mindset. Didn't mean that they didn't work hard. It meant that there was a knowledge gap on what they should have been doing all along, a smart and wise investment into the future of their children's future, or 529 and other ways that they can. So this educational mechanisms outside of, say, working hard is sometimes the problem that happens in our community. And I see it all the time. This is not just one or two cases, it's all the time.
Yeah. And we can so dangerously use scripture to kind of reinforce some of these really wicked views on really just a very corrupt theology of business. Like even the way we interpret things like the parable of the talents, and just kind of distilling that down to, well, if you're not making a bunch of money, then you must be that wicked, lazy slave that buried his talent. Or, looking at scriptures like the poor will always be among you, for example, often just grossly taken out of context. And so, you're always just going to have poor people. So just, hey, they make their decisions, and it's probably because they're, the market forces are working against them because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so it's just so critical to look at things from God's perspective. And what does God have to say about our neighbor, and how in a as it relates to income inequality, and as much as it depends on us as Christian business managers, and that's pretty much all of us. I mean, that's the main character in virtually all of Jesus's parables, was a business, some sort of a resource manager. What is God calling us to do?
Yeah. I heard a preacher preach that passage that you just referenced about you will always have the poor with you. And he was preaching that the job of Christians is not to eradicate poverty or to address the problem of poverty, or to address it, but not try to eradicate it. Because if we tried to, it would be a vision against what Jesus was talking about. And I think that, a person with means, it's easy for them to say that, right? But a person in poverty don't read that passage that way. The person in poverty reads it the opposite, saying, hey, pay attention to us because we're here and there is a need among us. And while there may be always someone in need, it is the call of the church to always try to address and to deliver people from the evil of poverty, because poverty is evil. And one way to look at that is to say our job is never done. Not that we shouldn't work towards achieving the goal of eradicating our poverty. We should work toward that goal with everything within us, because poverty, a person in poverty knows how painful poverty is.
Yeah. And for those of us listening to this podcast, I mean, the Great Commission is not going to all the world and eradicate poverty necessarily. It's to go make disciples, because when we make disciples, we're fulfilling, at least as much as it depends on us, to help somebody else move ahead. That's what discipleship is, right? It's like Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ, and just helping somebody, whatever God has given to me, I'm going to make that available to you because you're my neighbor, right? I mean, isn't that the way we ought to approach it?
Amen. Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's one thing if you are living in a society where everything starts at the same place, right? Samuel D. Proctor, we read his book, Certain Sound of the Trumpet, in the class that you had with me. Mm-hmm. He preached a sermon and he talked about beneath the scratch line. That was the name of the sermon. And he says that, some people are born above the scratch line and some people are born beneath the scratch line. And depending on our families and our family history would determine whether we're born above the scratch line or beneath the scratch line. Not everybody is born in the same place. And he said that the people that are born above the scratch line have a responsibility to the people who were born beneath the scratch line. And he used his own life as an example. He's an African-American preacher, or was African-American preacher in the mid-1900s. And he says that, his mom and dad went to church, went to Sunday school. So he was, great people in the city of Norfolk, Virginia, respectable people in the community. So he was born with his grandmother, taking him to church and make sure he went to school and make sure he even went to college. But he had some boys around the way whose dad never did go to Sunday school, was an alcoholic. And so he was born into a situation beneath the scratch line. So you cannot look at a person who's born beneath the scratch line and a person who's born above the scratch line and just say, well, they have the same opportunity. Well, they may have the same opportunity, but they don't have the same resources to access the opportunity. So part of love of the neighbor is to take the advantage that I have and try to reach out to my neighbor to help them be at a place where they can also live above the scratch line. So when they have children, their children are not born now beneath the scratch line. So that's the love of the neighbor. That's what Christianity is about. That's, in that case, Dr. Samuel D. Proctor was talking about two African-American people in the middle of 1900. He was even discussing, I'm African-American by virtue of being African-American. I am beneath a certain scratch line. and there's a white person. He said, let's take this out of the black and white discussion. Let's talk about it as just a merely human discussion. Mm-hmm. We all have different advantages in life. And it's just a general Christian principle for us to attend to the need of the neighbor, not as a handout, right? Don't just give me money, but teach me how to fish so I can, don't just give me a fish unless I'm in a crisis and need a relief, but teach me how to fish so that I can also live into the fullness of my humanity and provide for my family for the long haul. So I think that we're not just, I think that the old model of Christian charity we have to rethink that, because the old model of Christian charity is to take something to people and give it to them and feel good about ourselves about doing it. Yeah. But that can empower poverty, right?
Right.
How do we not just give people a handout, but give them a hand up so that they can stand on their own 2 feet?
And this is a broader issue that we talk about really pretty much across all the episodes on this show. And it's this discipleship is what is really the missing piece.
Yeah.
Because we can complicate things so much when ultimately it just comes down to spending time with people and helping them to become more like Christ. It's imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's what Paul said. And that happens economically. It happens in, the way I see you, loving your wife, loving your spouse, parenting your kids, like just how you do your job. All of those different things are context for discipleship. So I just love talking to you, brother. Where do you want to direct people to learn more about you and what you're working on?
Well, thank you. My social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Follow me at DrAntipas. That's at DrAntipas. That's at Dr. Antipas. Or my website, which is antipasharris.com. And for Jake's Divinity School is at Jake's Divinity or jakesdivinity.org.
Beautiful. All right. Well, we'll have those in the show notes. Dr. Antipas, Dr. A, sure appreciate you. May God continue to bless everything you're doing in the Jake's Divinity School. Bless your family, and sure appreciate you sharing with us today.
Thank you so much. It's such a delight. Thanks for having me on the show.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can share your feedback and get more information to help you partner with God in business and disciple your company, your industry, and your community at theologyofbusiness.com. The Theology of Business podcast is sponsored by Highbridge Books and Media, a media agency specializing in publishing and promoting the world-changing ideas of inspiring thought leaders through book publishing, website development, publicity, email marketing, social media management, podcast management, and video-based course publishing. Take the next step to share your message with the world by contacting us at highbridgemedia.com. Thanks for listening, and keep partnering with God in your business.